Okay, it's the 9th of November, Friday, the 9th of November, 2 days before Armistice Day, or Remembrance Sunday. That's when the First World War ended, on the 11th hour of the 11th month. It's when it ended, so that's why you have it on these days. Remembrance Sunday, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, drew to the end of World War I, to allow the politicians and the establishments to prepare for even greater bloodbath known as World War II. If there had been no World War I, there certainly would have been no World War II. And we're very fortunate that we didn't have a World War III, or haven't had a World War III so far, which certainly wouldn't have lasted for 4 years and would have been a nuclear holocaust that mankind, or humanity, would have been completely obliterated, except for a few pockets of survivors somewhere. And that's it. But I'd like to talk about the whole poppy wearing thing and about World War I and everything, because, you know, it has a great resonance. The poppy obviously represents the flower that sprouted on the fields of combat in World War I during the trench warfare. And it became a symbol thereafter of the end of the war, and the British Legion themselves sell the poppy, and people wear the poppy in remembrance, not only of World War I, but World War II and all the other wars that have taken place. But it's a peculiarly British thing. People don't wear poppies in America, they don't wear them in France, for example. Only wear them here. And I think that here they do represent something that's creepily conformist. I don't condemn people that wear poppies, but I will say this. So by wearing a poppy, you're actually supporting the armed forces, supporting our wars, our imperial wars and so on, and supporting the system. And have you noticed on television lately, on all the current affairs programs, sports programs, in fact anything that's broadcast live, everybody, every presenter, every guest, everybody is wearing a poppy. What is with this mass conformity? I noticed the other day on Newsnight that Paul Mason was not wearing a poppy. That was so weird. Someone that's not wearing a poppy, that is a definite political statement not to wear a poppy. Paul Mason is well known as someone that's highly critical of capitalism and capitalism's wars. He's written many books. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But he is definitely what you might call, by any criteria, an anti-establishment figure, even though he appears to be part of the establishment, which he probably is really by being on the BBC. But I'll ignore that and say that at least he showed the guts not to wear a poppy, which meant that he did not approve of the glorification of war, because that's basically what the poppy is, rather than remembrance of the people that were slaughtered. And what about the slaughter? What about World War I? What particularly and specifically was it about? Well, it appears on the surface to be a dynastic quarrel between the various royal houses of Europe, some of which were obliterated as a result. It's a damn pity that our lot weren't obliterated, but that's another story, isn't it? Why didn't we have a revolution in Britain? And why were the revolutions in Germany and Russia eventually unsuccessful in their various ways? But World War I itself, when it broke out, people would say, as was saying in 1914, it'll all be over by Christmas. All the militarization, all the build-up for the war. Some say it was a dynastic squabble between monarchs and their armies. Others say it was to do with markets, world trade. Others say it was due to Germany not having any colonies or any colonies worth talking about in Africa and so on, because the French and the British had grabbed most of them. It was probably a combination of all these things, plus even the fact that they'd been gearing up for war anyway. And once the assassination in Sarajevo had taken place, the whole war machine just geared up and went automatically. So it wasn't over by Christmas. It sunk into the stalemate of trench warfare. Trench warfare is kind of a new thing. It had occurred during the American Civil War, for example. One of the first big examples of trench warfare, but there were other examples. But I think the American Civil War was the first big example of trench warfare, which wasn't exclusive to the American Civil War, but did play a good deal of it, particularly around the Petersburg area. Anyway, the war, we all know, we've all seen images of it, and there's some very good films, commercial films about the First World War that were made, including probably the greatest anti-war movie of all time, All Quiet on the Western Front, which was made in about 1930. I think everybody should watch that film. It's an anti-war movie. It shows the horrors of warfare, but it also shows why people became soldiers, the pressure that was upon them, comradeship and so on. It's shown from the German perspective, but it could be British, French, or anybody really. It's a very humane film, even though it shows the horrors of war, particularly trench warfare. So my advice to anybody that really wants to see anything about war is to watch the original version of All Quiet on the Western Front. And also perhaps to watch Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, Paths of Glory, which deals with the French army and trench warfare in the French army and the degeneracy of the main command, the generals and so on and so forth. So watch those movies. They're anti-war. They do not glorify war, and I think that they give some sort of perspective as to what World War I was about. And also, if you want to read something about it, Martin Middlebrook's The First Day of the Somme, where 10,000 British soldiers were slaughtered in one day of trench warfare, or Leon Wolf's In Flanders Fields, which is an excellent book about the horrors of trench warfare as well. These are things I would advise everybody to read, because if you were to read them, you would say, and also read Alistair Horn's account of the Battle of Verdun, where about 750,000 people were slaughtered in that particular battle, which lasted for several months. Probably the worst battle that ever occurred in the history of humanity. This is all during World War I, all on the Western Front, and I don't see why we should be celebrating it. In fact, it should be a cause for embarrassment that we allowed ourselves, or our ancestors allowed themselves, to be marched off quite willingly to die for king and country, or Kaiser and country, or Kaiser and fatherland. People went off quite willingly, thinking it'd just last for a few months, it would be a great adventure. But of course the generals, the politicians, the people that don't actually fight the wars, the arms manufacturers, who love wars because it's profit, and the longer the war goes on, the better it is for them, the more money they make. These people had no idea that warfare would have evolved into it. They thought it was all going to be cavalry, stuff like that. They didn't really, they didn't realise that, of the machine gun, the Maxim machine gun. And also out of the First World War came gas and tanks and aircraft used in combat, barbed wire. The horrors are just completely beyond description. First day of the Somme, as I've mentioned, 10,000 British were killed. The Germans had been subjected to 3 or 4 weeks intense bombardment. It was expected by the geniuses of the General Staff, who in their chateaus about 20 miles behind the front lines and supping on their wines and having their beds made by their batmen and so on, had no idea of what was really going on. So they'd been bombarding the German lines for about 2 or 3 weeks, expecting their troops to march over basically blank and empty space. So they loaded the troops up with I think it was about 80 pounds worth of baggage, including weaponry and so on, to march over this territory to reclaim the shattered trenches. In fact, what had happened was the Germans had dug their trenches really deep, about 20 feet, and so they were more or less unaffected by the bombardment. Some were buried alive. When the troops marched, led by their nincompoop officers, some of who were carrying swagger sticks, cricket bats and kicking footballs to urge their men forward, they were met by withering machine gun fire. Wave after wave were cut down half a mile from the nearest German trench. Absolutely no gain was made whatsoever. In the first day, 10,000 people were killed. You look at all the other battles in World War I, it's exactly the same. A victory was counted, if you won like 200 yards. If you went and took the enemy's first line of trench, it was a victory. Even though, you might have had 20,000 people killed to do it. And the generals and the people organising all this, the politicians, the people that didn't have to do any fighting, just fed over the space of 4 years, the politicians from all sides, the generals, they just fed millions and millions and millions of their fellow countrymen into this machine, this industrial killing machine. And so it ended up 5 million dead in the trenches and trench warfare, just as many severely injured with their legs blown off and their faces blown off, suffering from the effects of gas and so forth. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, when finally the last shot was fired and fighting went right up to the last minute, Germany lost, and we and the French and the Americans won. And this is what's celebrated really in Armistice Day. In Whitehall on Sunday you will see the monarchy, the people like Prince Charles sort of absolutely bedecked with medals, even though he's never fought in a battle or anything. All the politicians there, the people that make wars, the establishment, everybody wearing poppies, lots of the old soldiers marching by and everything. And then later on in the afternoon people say that the cenotaph, or some anti-fascists from the left, say that the cenotaph will then be desecrated because the National Front and the British National Party are going to turn up and have their own miserable, ill-attended ceremonies. Well, I don't actually think that the BNP and the National Front are desecrating the cenotaph. I actually think that the whole of Whitehall is a complete disgrace and an absolute desecration anyway. The statues to Earl Haig, the overall commander of the British forces during World War I, who sent hundreds of thousands of his fellow countrymen to death for absolutely no reason whatsoever except to bolster up the monarchy and the system here. At least the Germans managed to overthrow their Kaiser, but we, on the contrary, continue to worship the royals and to worship people like Earl Haig, whereas I regard people like Earl Haig or Marshal Haig as a war criminal. And at the end of World War I, the troops, the workers and everybody else, they should have overthrown this evil system that led to this mass death and mutilation and so on, which led to a world afterwards that led to the rise of fascism, Nazism, World War II and all the horrors thereof. So there's nothing to celebrate about World War I. We should hang our heads in shame that there's statues to these people. We should also hang our heads in shame at the fact that some hapless punk might spray an A on the base of the statue of Earl Haig and get 6 months for it. So we've got war criminals, people that should have been tried and executed as war criminals, people like Haig and the rest of them, French, the whole thing of the cenotaph and so on. The whole thing is an absolute disgrace. It should never have existed. But we have allowed ourselves to glorify World War I, to glorify World War II, which was a direct result of World War I. And we continue to glorify war. And we continue to glorify soldiers and so on. And in the main wars, most soldiers were conscripts. But in the squalid wars that we've had in modern times, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, the soldiers are volunteers. They've joined up. They know exactly what they're going to go to. But they join. I don't actually see them as heroes. Every time a soldier gets killed in Afghanistan, he's a hero. But there are no heroes here. There's no heroes on any side. But certainly our boys, as they're called, are not heroes. And there's a whole kind of vulgar, almost obscene, necrophiliac thing about the soldiers, their remains coming back in coffins, and the whole wooden basset thing, which is now royal wooden basset. The coffins going through of the dead soldiers, who were probably did not die as heroes at all, but died in squalid circumstances, probably shot by a sniper that they never saw, blown up by an improvised bomb by some guy with a beard on the top of a hill just pressing a button, or even killed by someone in the Afghan security forces. There seems to be much more of that. And you see the soldiers in Afghanistan, and they're standing in poppy fields. Aren't we supposed to be waging a war against drugs? And yet those poppy fields end up as heroin on our streets, and the soldiers there are defending the poppy growers, because the poppy growers are supported by the government, because the poppy industry is the main industry in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan's turned out to be a mess, as is Iraq, and all the other squalid little wars. And you look at Ireland, for example, Northern Ireland, the Bloody Sunday Massacre, where soldiers shot down 14 and killed 14 completely unarmed people. Again, it's the same story. The British government was, the IRA was shooting at soldiers. There was no IRA shooting at soldiers. They were unarmed demonstrators, were mown down by crazed paratroopers. And this is the calibre of people that are in the army. They are brutalised because their training brutalises them, and they're probably half brutalising them in order to join the army anyway, because you know what you're going to be doing when you join the army, apart from learning a trade or seeing another country, and that's killing people. And you may, if there was ever any kind of upheaval in this country, be on the streets shooting down your own brothers and sisters, because this is what armies do eventually. Armies are really not so much to defend the nation state, but basically, if everything else fails, they are there to repress the local population. And if you think that's a bit of an exaggeration, I know that this doesn't apply to England yet, unless of course you look up what happened in Northern Ireland, which was a squalid colonial war with internment camps, assassination squads, dirty tricks, soldiers being shot down on the streets, assassinated by the IRA, them assassinating the IRA, loyalist death squads. This is war. But they didn't have the troops marching back in glory from Ulster. They kind of come like the troops in America came back from Vietnam, kind of like unrecognised and sort of almost skulking in embarrassment. But under the Labour regime, under Blair, who really loved war, the Labour Party certainly became the party of war. And they're sending out troops to Iraq, Afghanistan, and they inaugurated this thing of marching the troops through cities when they came back. And there was an occasion when they were marching through Luton, and all the bearded nutters from the Taliban love club turned up to abuse the soldiers, who were then attacked by the crowd, and that led to the formation of the EDL. And I hold the Labour Party, not the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Labour government, wholly responsible for this phenomena. They're the ones that went to war. They're the ones that inaugurated these march-throughs and so forth, which led to the bearded nutters having a go at the soldiers, which led to the people attacking the bearded nutters and the birth of the EDL. So I blame them. And I say that the thing, Remembrance Sunday, is one of the most obscene things imaginable. It's absolutely, completely obscene. It's got nothing to do with remembering soldiers were killed. It's more to do with the glorification of war. And Cameron will probably be there. Cameron, the man who was out to the Middle East earlier on this week selling military technology, I think it was aircraft in this particular case, to repressive regimes in the Middle East. Regimes that we condemn, but it's all right to do trade with them, of course, and to train their army and their police force, and to give them not only fighter jets, but also to sell them torture implements. It's good for trade, after all. And with a trade like, it's actually worth having industry that actually, if this is Britain's main product, military aircraft and so on, which are incidentally our own army can't even afford to have all this stuff. They're cutting down on our own army, or our army, their army. But it's all right to sell them to these despots who've got like oil money coming out of their rich, who haven't even got the soldiers and the trained personnel to fly these things themselves. They have to hire them from Russia and so on, hire mercenaries to do it. So yeah, war is disgusting and war is obscene. I'm not a pacifist. I believe in class war, but I don't believe in imperial war. And I think the people that join the army are mugs myself. And I think that they're proved to be mugs. They come back with their legs blown off. And what happens to them? Well, they even have to fight, to get even some measly kind of compensation. A lot of ex-soldiers are sleeping on the streets. The majority of people sleeping on the streets in central London are ex-soldiers. They don't do anything for their people at all. But still, in the head of the ex-soldier, there they are, sleeping out under a sleeping bag down by the embankment, but they're still all for Queen and country. They do a great job, a very great job of brainwashing people. And I would say to anybody that wants to join the army, don't. Because what is the army anyway? Apart from being taught a trade, drive a lorry, fix a car, fire a gun, kill somebody. The whole thing's completely hierarchical. Working class people that become ordinary soldiers and troopers who join the army are bossed about by a load of upper class twits that have been to Sandhurst and Eton and so on, barked at, humiliated. The whole of the army's got a culture of bullying and so on as well. Look at what happened down there in Sussex. I can't remember the name of the place. Deep something, I swear. About 6 soldiers died in mysterious circumstances. Whole of the army, and this is just full of bullying and so on. So don't join the army. Don't be a soldier. Being a soldier, you're supporting the system. If you're unemployed, move to another part of the country, or move to another country and work. There's plenty of work. Being unemployed is not an excuse to join the army, as far as I'm concerned. You join the army, if you get shot in Afghanistan, I'm sorry to say this, but it fucking serves you right. You've got no right to be there. Got no right to be there at all. You are one person, but you are part of the whole jigsaw, adding up to future wars, future miseries, and even future bombings on the tube over here. You are part of it. Be anti-war. But to be anti-war is not enough. To be pacifist is not enough. The only solution to end wars on a worldwide basis, because if I was like in America or any other country, a belligerent country, say the same thing. What argument have we got with the British soldiers? Why should we join up? Why should we defend the system? Why should we be barked at by people from the upper classes who constitutes the officer class? So don't join the army. I've never been attracted to join the army, and I know loads of people that haven't, but people I know that have been in the army, a lot of them have been completely fucked up as a result. Not only physically, but mentally as well. So yeah, don't join the army. There's one more thing I'd like to say as well about Cameron, is that they're putting on the educational syllabus a thing that kids have got to visit the graveyards in France from World War I, which I've described, and everybody who does recognise more or less, as a completely meaningless and pointless slaughter with absolutely no glory to it whatsoever. This is not to show the children the futility and the horrors of war. This is to glorify war. And this is what we've got. Labour, Conservative, they're glorifying the army. They're glorifying war. I say, and then a lot of other people say, just watch All Quiet on the Western Front. Is it these politicians, these arms manufacturers, these aristocrats, the ruling class, if they really want to go to war, let them go to fucking war and fight it, and not us. Let them get slaughtered. Perhaps if wars are only fought between the politicians, and the monarchs and the mullahs and so on, then perhaps, and the generals, if they all fought each other and we just sat back and watched it all, then maybe there wouldn't be too many wars, because the people who were making the wars would have slaughtered themselves. And of course, we'd have no reason to go to war, would we? Because we wouldn't be fighting in their arguments, and we might have a new society. The only way we're going to get a new society is to fight for it. We ain't going to fight for it by supporting this society, by supporting their wars and so on. So say no to wars. Regard Poppy Day as an obscenity for what it really is. I'm not being unpatriotic. I'm not being a traitor, because patriotism doesn't come into my head. And as for being a traitor, that means you support the other side. So I don't support the other side either. I just say to hell with war, to hell with the politicians, to hell with the arms manufacturers, to hell with the war lovers. Let them fight the wars, not us, not our class. One other thing about war as well, as war has developed over the 20th and 21st century, the majority of people that die in wars nowadays are not soldiers, but civilians. Now think of that. The wars all over the world, I'd say that about 90 to 95% of the casualties as a result of atrocities, disease, displacement, refugees, etc., bombed by drones, bombed by B-52s, aircraft, missiles and so on. The vast majority of people that die in wars these days, or a result of wars, are civilians. It's not soldiers versus soldiers anymore. So soldiers versus soldiers is bad enough. But when millions and millions of civilians die, and 3 million plus civilians have died in the unknown war in the Congo, plus 1 million in Rwanda, 500,000 in Burundi, Uganda and so on. This is war, and most of these people have been civilians. And not only have they died from disease, but mass rape, atrocities, cannibalism. This is the sort of thing that war results in. And cannibalism was practiced, particularly in World War II, by troops, particularly in the Japanese theatre of war, in the concentration camps, in the bombed out cities, Leningrad. Cannibalism was practiced. This is what war means in the end. Mass death of civilians, cannibalism, barbarism. Say no to war. Say no to their war. Say yes to class war. Overthrow them. Make sure there's no war. Do not wear your poppy with pride. Do not wear a poppy. Do not become involved in it. That's all I've got to say. The whole war thing makes me really angry and makes a lot of other people really angry. But when you look at the television, you think that everybody was for the war. Walk around the streets, you'll see hardly anybody wearing poppies. One place where they do wear loads of poppies is in the city of London, where all the bankers are and so on, where they do very well out of war. One of the biggest industries, thank you very much. So yeah, they can wear their poppies. And they will wear them with pride. The pride of the fact that, you know, they're making like vast amounts of money out of other people's misery. And don't join the army. Don't fight for them. Fight against them. One of these days maybe we'll have our own armies and militias, which you have to have in a revolution. And maybe, like, when we get to that stage, maybe the troops will refuse to fire on their fellow countrymen. And that's when revolutions happen. When troops refuse to fire on their fellow countrymen and countrywomen. I hope it doesn't come to that here, because I hope that if we do have a revolution, they don't use troops to crush us. But if they do, or they attempt to, if the police fail, then there could be a bloodbath. But maybe not. Maybe, you know, if really we're winning, we might win over a lot of troops. So I say to troops, in the future, if it ever happens, shoot your officers. Unless they come over to the revolution, shoot your officers and shoot all the politicians, a lot of them, left, right or centre. And that's bloodthirsty, And it sounds like a fantasy, and perhaps it is. But better to have a fantasy than the reality of war. World War One, World War Two, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the other wars and butcheries that have taken place at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. So that's all I've got to say for the moment on that particular subject. The only slogan I can say is, don't wear the poppy. It only encourages them, makes us think that we go along with it. And most of us don't. But we're silenced into a form of conformity. And as I said at the very beginning, that conformity is shown on the television. And on the 12th of November, none of them will be wearing poppies again. It'll all go back to normal until next year. And then, of course, we have the anniversary of the First World War coming up. The beginning of the First World War, which was August 1914. And there'll be big celebrations about that, I suppose, as well. But as I said, read those books I recommended, watch those films. There's a lot more books and there's a lot more films, particularly about World War One. I think World War One was a pivotal war of all wars. So with that, I'd like to say goodbye until next time. And I don't know what I'll be talking about next time, but there's so much scandal erupting lately. There's just so much that's making us all angry. And I hope to express this anger, as I express the anger all the time, on the next podcast. So, from me, goodbye, and that's it.